during the first kibush as well, didn't they also make a chazaka? Can we suggest that a chazaka without a kibush is superior to a chazaka in conjunction with a kibush? So he says there's also, what is a chazaka? Chazaka means you're situated in the place. You're stationing, taking ownership. By the first kibush also, what happened? They went into Eretz Yisrael, they conquered Eretz Yisrael, and they what? And they have a chazaka that they're there for many, many years. So why is that stronger? Okay, so just to recap, just to explain, we brought up Rambam yesterday that Rambam says the first kedusha rishayna eina ela mepnei shu kibush rabim. Since there was a kibush rabim, so he says v'kiv shenuk lacharis miyodeim. Once Eretz Yisrael was taken away from them, so batla kibush. And then he says v'kiv and sha'ala ezra kedusha like v'kitcha like kitcha v'kibush adam chazaka shechziku. And therefore, basically, the Rambam says that any time, any place that the Yidden conquered or above made a chazaka, it belongs to them. So the Kesef Mishnah asks 1 second. First of all, why is the koyach chazaka that they made in the time of Ezra, why is it any stronger than the kibush? And number two, he asks, is kibush, the first time that they made the conquest was with the chazaka. So the cher it's even stronger. The second time they got reshus. So they got reshus, they made a chazaka. Okay, so the Rebbe says this. We do ask Zanidah, Kama Biyurim and Divrei Rambam. It's known there are many well explanations in the Rambam's view. Aleph, he says like this. The Radbaz says, V'nir l'daiti, seems to me, if you should like kitchu bepeh, ela b'me'ezer kitchu bepeh. So Radbaz says, and the Rebbe is going to ask on this, that the distinction lies that during the first initial conquest, they did not verbally sanctify Eretz Yisrael. Whereas in the times of Ezra, they verbally sanctified Eretz Yisrael. So the Rebbe says like this in the Radvaz, firstly, we don't find it's mentioned in the times of Ezra that they verbally sanctified the land. Secondly, the Rambam does not even hint at this rationale. On the contrary, the Rambam is mevar befedish. The Rambam says clearly, as thus, this, that the second time the Eden came up to Eretz Yisrael is leibotla is nitval kitchu bepeh, not because they verbally sanctified it, nor v'alei kitchu b'kibush ela b'chazaka shechziku ba. The Rambam says clearly it was not sanctified by peh. It doesn't say that. He says it was not sanctified through conquest, but through chazaka. However, in the first sanctity, this was accomplished through conquest. So the Rambam says clearly. So that's the question on the Radbaz. The Radbaz wants to make a difference between Kitchu B'Per or not. So the Rebbe, first of all, the Rambam doesn't say that. And on the contrary, the Rambam doesn't say this is the difference. The Rambam says the difference is clear. The first one was with a kibush, and the second one was not with a kibush, what was accomplished through chazaka. Okay, so that's when you verbalize something. The reason why Eretz Yisrael the first time didn't have that sanctity that lasted forever is because they didn't verbalize it b'peh. As I zokter, but the Rebbe obviously says that when you verbalize, well, yeah, you have to say it. The Rebbe obviously doesn't like the answer. He says clearly that that's not pshat in the Rambam. All right. Okay. Number two, the Tesis Yom for the Kasha from Kesef Mishnah. Tesis Yom answers the Kesef Mishnah's question. It says like this: the Svirle, the Kibush Nochrim, also Mevatel Kibush Yisrael. He says that Gentiles, Goyim, they came and they nullified the Yid's earlier conquest. However, when it came to in regards to the chazaka, to the land, so we acquired them to So later, the conquest cannot come and nullify the effects of the chazakah done with the consent of the Persian king. So when you have, so the Tesis Yantav is saying like this, that the first time, since there was no chazakah, the kibush from the goyim comes and nullifies our kibush. The chazakah land that we acquired, the king gave us rishus, and the king permitted us. So the later cannot come by the effects of the chazakah done. Fine. So the Rebbe says, "No, but these explanations do not answer both of the Kesem Mishnah." If the goyim's conquest constitutes a general acquisition, nullify the Yid's, the Jewish people's original ownership, if that really works, is was vet da zugeben as the friedige Gebeiles gekommen nicht durch Kibush, Chazaka wenn der King von Kibush Muhammad Sadi Nachrim bleibt doch die Scheile bloß Kesem Mishnah lo mal in Chazaka gamkin mission Likkutei Ars Medina but the Chazaka. The Rebbe says that at the end of the day it doesn't really answer the Kesem Mishnah's question, because if you're saying that the kibush that nullifies the Jewish people's original ownership, why would this change if the original ownership was affected not as a result of the kibush but as a result of the chazakah that was done with the consent of the actual nation? Since the goyim's military conquest actually Api Halacha produces an acquisition, so the question of the Kesem Mishnah still stands. Why don't we not apply the same reasoning to chazakah, that once the land was taken from our hand, the chazakah was nullified? In other words, if they have the power to take away through kibush, they have the power to take away the kedusha, they should have the power to take it away through chazakah as well.
What does the chazakah do?
Yeah, what does the chazakah help? You made a chazakah, okay, so now the kibush took away the chazakah. Okay. Yes, there's a bleib shred the straight shaila. Similarly, the second question also remains unanswered. During Yeshua's times, the Jewish people also acquired part of the land with the consent of the giver. As the Givanim haben übergegeben Zere Städt zu den Jiden. You find that the Givanim surrender their cities to the Jewish people. Bafal became in the Ram is the Ram the kibush nuklecha aretz miyadeim batal kibush mishvis. So we find that the Givanim, who they wanted, it's a shaila if they get emes or not, that we were alluding to in the Gemara share, but we don't find that the Rambam makes a difference between this place in Eretz Yisrael. They can't really take away the kedusha because it was given with consent. The Rambam says the entire Eretz Yisrael. Therefore, when the land was taken from their hands, the original consent was nullified. So according to Torah, the land was freed from, and he says that that's why the land was freed from Shvis, Meiser, etc. Gimel. The Rebbe says like this: the Tesis Yamtiv is dort in Mamshech. The Tesis Yamtiv continues and says like this: Ve'ein lahashiv in asinas Hashem Yisbarach shenasna liyisrael b'risheina sheyesh lahashiv. He says, don't counter that Hashem gave the land to the Jewish people with their first conquest, because you could respond and say, you could say, at the same way Hashem gave the land to the Jewish people, so the prophets also prophesied that the destroyers would ascend and take it away. Similarly, his prophets also prophesied that Kadesh, who was the king of Persia, would return it to them. So he says that you don't find an explicit nevuah about this nation of, let's say, Edom and the Romans, who were the ones that took Eretz Yisrael away the second time, taking the land from our hand. Therefore, they did so illegitimately, and the land cannot be stolen. That's what the Tesis Yamtiv says. Don't say that. So the Rebbe says like this. Aber l'cheira bleibt noch alt shred zu verstehen. But still, we need to understand. However you look at it. If we presume that a military conquest constitutes an acquisition that can displace the original owner, it could be b'lashon of it could be mafkia. It could displace it. Sizakinyin gomor apiadin, which means that it's a complete acquisition according to Torah law. Is my nafki minit simir gefint anavua oiv der kibush hadernit v'bald as is given my sakinyin. So at the end of the day, what difference does it make if there's a prophecy or not? At the end of the day, they performed an act that constituted a legitimate acquisition. So the Tesis Yom Tov is going to say that the first time there was a nevuah, so since there's a nevuah, they have the power to take away the kedusha of Eretz Yisrael. Mashenki, when it came to Edom and the Romans who destroyed Eretz Yisrael or who conquered Eretz Yisrael the second time, that they don't have, there was no nevuah. Rebbe says, if it works al pidin, that you can be mafkia al pidin by a kibush, it should work the second time as well. And if, on the flip side, perhaps the kavanah is that a non-Jew cannot acquire land through military conquest, when a yeh says, oif, dem kibush nochrim, noch dem kibush sheni is nit given kein nevuah, and since there was no prophecy about the Goyish conquest following the second conquest, so they did so unlawfully, and the whole notion of military conquest is illegitimate. Is heroas shoy hoiso ulahem nikna bekibush is das aber nit behesem mit dem biaramam. Now, if you say that in contrast to Nebuchadnezzar and Kodesh, who conquered the land by Hashem's word, and it was an exceptional act enabling them to acquire the land through conquest, so l'chera, this explanation does not align with the Rambam's explanation. Why? The Rambam is invited that Tama Chiluk Demid, was Kedusha Yishen is given durch Kibush, Kedusha Shnia durch Chazaka. The Rambam says clearly that the first Kedusha, the first time the Kedusha Yishen was through conquering, and the Kedusha Shnia was durch Chazaka, through Chazaka. Well, the fear now is das nit totally in the Kinyan von Yidden. Based on what they're explaining, it has nothing to do with how the Yidden are koina, nor in them oifen akibush from the umas. Rather, it has to do with the way that the Goyim conquered. Agalus Bavel hati kedusha gekent bottle veren, afilu ven zivolt given aide chazaka. Why? Because the Galus Bavel could have been, the kedusha could have been bottled even if they took it through chazaka. Kibush Nebuchadnezzar is given kidin, because the kibush of Nebuchadnezzar was done api halacha. Shenken by Satan kibu galos. However, by the second galos, vibal the umas haven kevish given shleikidin. Since the umas conquered it shleikidin, verdanach their fire the kedusha not bottled. That's why the kedusha was not bottled. It says afilu ven zivolt yikumin nor the kibush. So basically, the Rambam makes clearly a difference between chazaka and a kibush, and the way that the Tesis Yontif are explaining. It comes out that it has to do if there wasn't a nevuah, there wasn't a nevuah, you had permission, nothing to do with the actual king. And so, based on that, it will come out that the first time, if they had permission, so even if they made a chazaka, they were able to be koivishit, and the second time as well, even if they did not make a chazaka, they took it. Shalaikidin Dalid. But again, the zweite Shaila now what man khayre gekent enfren. So we can answer the second question. The way other commentaries explain the Rambam, Hagam as eich by kibush Yeshua is given chazaka, even though by the kibush of Yeshua was also chazaka, like the Kesef Mishnah said, Habin aber the Yidden bepeil it kenen given b'chazaka. He says that the Yidden did not acquire through chazaka. He says their kavan is given to kenen zayin dafke mit kibush. They in mind, yes, they made a chazaka, but in their mind, they wanted it to be done through kibush. And therefore, their power of chazaka did not really accomplish anything. And he says, and we find this din based on a person who, let's say, works in the property of a deceased ger, thinking that the land was his own. does not acquire the land. The halacha is by a ger that if a ger dies with not any, right, doesn't die with any hairs, any yershim, so I guess right. What do you say? Call whoever. It's hefker.
Every time a person makes a chazaka, he has to have the wine?
1 second. So this halacha is like this: a ger passes away, doesn't have any children. So now the property is hefker because he basically has no inheritors. So any person who comes and performs an act of kinyan becomes the rightful owner. Now this person, he had incorrect kavana. So since his kavana was he wasn't koine mitzad like you asked. He wasn't koine mitzad the because he knew what he was doing or he had the right kavana. He thought that it's his. But by MS, had it's the ger's, and the ger he could have been acquired it because it's hefker. But he thinks that he's being oider in his own property. So what's the halacha? The halacha is he's not koine. So what do we see? Like Mati, like you were saying, we see that kavana has to do. What's the guy's kavana? Is the kavana to be kovish or not? So since, even though, yes, they made a chazaka, but their kavana wasn't with the chazaka, their kavana was with the kibush. So since their kavana wasn't a kavana that could be acquired the rightful way, that's why, that's the difference. Yeah, you see from the case of the ger. Okay, aber neisef of them tzarchiin. So the Rebbe says, however, in addition to the tzarchiin, see the etzem svara hat an ord binyanenu. If taki you say this svara, vibalas benided and dan is dog kavana liknes nor ervil kenezai mit asvetin king. At the end of the day, he wants to acquire. So he acquires with not chazaka with a kibush, but he wants to acquire. Is there koina afilo on kavana? Befratas is a king deiraisa. Is schwer as it's learning kana. Why? By the orei hagivenim is doch über Hyped nit given ken kinyan von kibush machama. You find by the Orei Givenim there is no kibush machama. But the Givenim haben sie weggegeben mit they wanted it to be given over. Heintra was is euch by die Stadt nit chal given der kinyan hachazaka finyan. So why is it based on this? Why, at least at the towns of the Givenim, why did the Jewish people's acquisition using chazaka not affect at least these cities? All right, and tomorrow, Mr. Shem will learn the beer.